industry, if you're not on Twitter following some of these people, you're missing honest, heartfelt information that comes at you at light speed. You should have received an agenda in the show guide at registration to follow along for the rest of the day. Honestly, this is where we get going. It's time to fire the starting gun. It's my pleasure to introduce Chuck Rifici. Chuck founded and has been involved in the creation of some of Canada's largest and most successful cannabis efforts, starting in 2012. He's best known for co-founding Canopy Growth. He's the CEO and founder of Nesta Holdings, a private equity firm that creates wide-ranging partnerships and brands in the cannabis industry. He's currently the chairman and CEO of Auxly Group, a platform spanning the entire cannabis value chain that minimizes risk while maximizing exposure in multiple geographic, and we're going to hear about geographic and regional things today, diverse cannabis companies. I met Chuck for the first time last year at the Lift Expo. We started a conversation off Twitter, I think. And speaking of social media, if I recall the story correctly, your JV in Leamington was Peter approached you by LinkedIn. Social media, folks, if you have a store, if you have a business, get on board, follow along. It's very rare that an industry shares as much as the cannabis industry does on social media. He graciously took a chance with 3 guys from Reddit and did an Ask Me Anything. That Ask Me Anything's still up on our subreddit, and it's one of the most durable Ask Me Anythings we've had. It was fulsome, it was fun, and I think it's our 3rd highest hit viewed item on our subreddit. So he took a chance there, he's taking a chance here. Chuck, why don't you come up here? Thank you so much for coming. Do you need the forward button?
Yeah, just
Yeah.
for a second.
Yep.
Great. Well, listen, it's great to be in Edmonton. Thanks. Really appreciate Blue and the TheCannalysts. I really can't call him Craig. It doesn't work. And it's again, it's great to be here. Last time I was here, I was trying to sign a lease for a retailer at the West Edmonton Mall, and got scooped by some other local company. But that's what you get for playing in somebody's backyard. So it was great to be back. And also want to thank, obviously, Grant Thornton. I use them with some of my investments, and given that it's sponsored by an accounting firm, I thought I'd go full CPA today and wear a suit. Usually, as there was a picture up earlier with a T-shirt, that's usually how you'll find me. I guess I find it's helpful. I'm not going to talk about things I'm directly involved with, more about the industry, but. I think it's always good to look at, when you look at where somebody spends their time, where they invest, it gives you a sense of their biases and kind of where they're coming from, which helps kind of look at what I'm sharing today through that lens. And so let me put this on the screen somewhere. But obviously got involved with Tweed and Canopy in the early days. I've been on the boards of Aurora Supreme and Origin House. I had to leave those boards when I started Auxly. Due to the potential conflict of interest, as we're all kind of going towards the same goals with the next wave of legalization. But when I left Canopy, I started a company called Nesta, as Craig mentioned, and that was really a firm to, as I was sitting on my non-compete, non-solicit, figure out what was next. And what I was really excited about at the time was the next wave of products. Now this is 3.5 years ago, but I started a company called Feather, disposable vape pens. Really excited about, and I'll talk a little bit more about. Vapes is going to be a massive category coming into in later this year. I've invested a little bit in Dixie through Nesta, a company called WeeklyLeaf, price exploration apps. But I really love retail. I was an early investor in Tokyo Smoke, recently invested in Burb, a great little outfit that's in Poco in BC. But I was an early investor in National Access Cannabis about 3.5 years ago because I was just so excited about where retail was going, and there was no retailing at that time. Today, we're 6 months into retail, but for me, it's all about looking at the building blocks, where the industry is going, and how do you invest in or build companies that will be able to put that foundation down so that when the next race begins, that you can be you have a good starting block and you have some good momentum coming out of that. So we've really been happy to, obviously National Access Cannabis is the largest retailer in the country, but there's lots of great retailers out there, and that's still really shaking itself out in an exciting space. I did this industry about 6 years ago, and I find it's interesting. In the last 6 years, we've obviously seen a lot of change. We started off with a government that was not a fan of cannabis, that was forced into this, and it was all about getting applications in, moving fast. You had the blessed 13 LPs, as Terry from Aurora always likes to say, and Aurora really the largest LP outside of that first 13, which had a huge advantage. And then obviously a much friendlier government today, much more licenses. This morning I saw it was 177 various processor, producer licenses at different stages, and of course, not to mention all the retail licenses out there. And so this industry has grown, incredibly fast over the last few years. But although we're 6 years in, what's really interesting is we're only 6 months into legal, regulated retail. I try to avoid to use black market or unlicensed. I just think, regulated, licensed retail, and obviously that's what's going to stay. And it's really exciting. That model is still evolving, and I'll touch on that in a second. And we're 6 months away from the next generation, next wave of products, which is where really I think we're going to see what ultimately could be the biggest kind of industry reset, if you will, as the industry matures and the complexity and the true kind of the industry has to mature and grow up to compete in the same way that we see consumer packaged goods products, alcohol companies, big tobacco, et cetera. And so the next year is really going to be, we always talk about the cannabis industry being in dog years. So I think the next year is going to have as much change potentially as the first 6 years of this industry. With that, I just really want to talk about kind of three overlapping themes, things that excite me, things that I'm sure we'll hear about more today. And really, it's retail, it's the next wave of products, and supply shortages. And when will that change? And so, again, with retail, it's really nice to be in Alberta, which is really the retail capital or retail province, the best retail province in the country. We have the most licenses here. We have a government the provincial government that really understood and just let the market go. A very hectic time for those early retailers, in paying key fees, locking down real estate. And we saw, like we've seen with cultivation, like we're seeing in oil extraction today, first movers get disproportionately rewarded. Grab some water here. In this industry, and with retailers, we are seeing that. And what I find exciting about retail is that the supply shortages and the lack of next wave products, I think, actually are a great advantage for retailers, because it is, again, rewarding the early movers who can then raise those large amounts of capital to wait out the supply and wait out the new products, but also figure out the supply chain, because this is a new supply chain. And like we saw in Ontario with the OCS and other locations, you can have producers fulfilling their contracts, not all have, with the provincial distribution boards, but then, again, it's a massively new supply chain with many different intermediaries and government entities, and everybody's figuring it out as we go. We're building the plane as we fly it. And so retail is, I'm glad to just be an investor in retail. It's not a business I would want to operate, and I commend anybody who's in the retail business for cannabis. Retailing by itself is hard. The regulatory restrictions and the evolving regulatory landscape for cannabis retail is even harder, and then not having supply to put on your shelves is, any retailer would have an issue with that. And so there's lots of opportunity there. We see lack of CBD products. There's just a huge demand for CBD. The Farm Bill in the U.S. has really accelerated that, the excitement over CBD and the normalization of that. And it's, for me, retail is now, again, further accelerating the destigmatization of cannabis. And I think that's really important for kind of all Canadians. We still got to work on expungements and getting rid of people that have, cannabis possession charges. And that's going to come. It never comes fast enough. But I think retail is just, again, another piece of that puzzle that helps the average Canadian, the average policymaker think, we need to right these wrongs. And it helps, anybody working in this industry, I think, is indirectly, in a very small part, helping with those changes for Canadians who have been damaged by kind of the drug war of many decades. And so, with retail, I was trying to figure that out. The next wave of products for me, I said earlier, it's like an industry reset. And what I mean by that is I'll call it a game, but the game, if you will, early was about getting licenses, then about having multiple licenses, and how much square footage do you have? And then it was, well, what is the actual production capacity of your square footage, and what's your yield? How many kilos are you producing, or how much flour are you selling at the OCS or through Alberta retailers or others? But Well, the next wave of products, and as we've seen in Colorado and more mature legal U.S. states, most of the consumers are buying derivative products. And vape pens are the largest category of that. And what that does is it's an industry reset in that as long as supply is constrained, people that have supply will be able to get more economics and be able to decide which brands get on the shelves, which brands get made. But once supply basically gets to where demand is, it's not going to be good enough to grow. Everything that's grown is not going to get sold, and we're starting to see that in small amounts today. Poor cannabis is being discounted; it's not selling, and so when that shift happens, you're going to see, I think, unless you're operating really great small kind of craft indoor growers. And I know there's some great product in greenhouses, but most of the great craft product is going to be small indoor facilities. Unless you're a craft producer of super high quality cannabis, there's always room for quality, or you're basically producing very kind of low cost cannabinoids in a greenhouse or eventually outdoor. You don't want to be in that middle. Large indoor facilities that are producing mediocre cannabis, the value's at the edges. You want to be really cost efficient or very high quality. Or if your greenhouses or repurposed greenhouses I've never been a fan of, I don't think you get the right metrics in place. And so we're going to see, I think there's going to be a lot of write-downs for people as they have to we're going to end up with 5 or 6 probably large cultivators in this country that are supplying the industry. And once you have a spot price on cannabis molecules or on raw flower for extraction, or a spot price on various levels of extracted oil, whether it's winterized or for vape pens or distillates for edibles, then all the economic power, all the muscle, the brand building goes to the processors. And again, most of the major LPs are all kind of vertically integrated, but it's about processing. The amount of value you can create in an extraction facility where you can buy that product at a wholesale rate, and we see Hexo's elixir spray, a per gram equivalent price point of about $40 a gram, right? I would much rather wholesale to a provincial retailer at $15 to $20 per gram equivalent when I turn into a spray than a $3 to $4 per gram flower. And we're going to see that with a range of products. So it's incredibly disruptive to the economics of the industry, and it shifts power to the processors, and of course it then shifts more power to the retailers, because the retailers, it's unlike traditional retail. And I think this is why some retailers, we don't see the same valuations on retailers. We see great revenue numbers, but for some reason, I think the typical cannabis investor is thinking, well, that's not really defensible revenue, but it's not any retail. In Canada, it's a dark market. We have incredibly restricted, prohibited advertising for cannabis. It's not like tobacco, but it's very close. And so the consumer can only really get that information in a retail environment. And so if you own the retailer, you control that message. The bud tender has a lot of power. If you go into a dispensary in Colorado or Washington State, if any of you have been there, it's overwhelming the first time you walk in. You have 1,000 SKUs. What do I buy? Of course, you're going to ask the person at the counter, what, I'm looking for a chocolate, or I'm looking for a vape pen. What do you recommend? Incredible power to shape that consumer's experience, and in an environment where consumers are just beginning to build their brand awareness. The average Canadian does not know a cannabis brand. And my creative director at Auxly and former early employee at Tweed, who created the Tweed brand, he often likes to play a game where he'll see a server in a restaurant, just random person, and ask them, do you know Tweed? And they'll be like, the fabric? And so outside of the bubble of this industry, the brand race has not started yet. We're at zero. Compared to the brand awareness you have for any other major industry. And so that race for me begins with the next wave of products. And so who can make those products, who can make them efficiently, and who can get them on retailer shelves and defend that shelf space. And then that creates an incredible rush for this new shelf space that's going to get created. When I was in New Brunswick almost a year ago, New Brunswick was they very early in building out their retail landscape. They really embraced some call it a burden in some provinces, but the opportunity to be a leader in cannabis retailing. And they had to leave half their shelves kind of empty. They had these middle section of their stores with just empty information tables because they know this next wave of products are coming. We're going to see lots of flower get delisted. If you have a certain amount of retail, if your retail store is full, when these next wave of products come by, half your products are going to go out the door. You're going to get rid of them, make room for all the vape pens and edibles and chewables and beverages that you want to have. And so that's a big shift that's coming. So it's really exciting. And again, it creates value for kind of the majors and those that can really build out those manufacturing lines. In a typical industry, I got the pleasure to work with former president of Highliner Foods, and I've learned way too much about the dead fish supply chain in the last few months. But in any major CPG company, a line extension might be a 6-month project. But I can tell you that every major producer out there that wants to get into the next wave, which you're not in the rec business if you're not making these products, you're building out multiple lines, and these, you're doing it in an incredibly tight time frame, which is really, if you look at October 17th. When we were planning, you have to have your products basically ready to ship to a provincial distribution board by late summer, which means those lines will be producing by, midsummer, which is really 2 months away. So that planning had to be started about a year ago. And that's why we see, companies like Valens and MetaPharm and these extraction specialist companies, oils recently, that are doing brisk business because there was a bottleneck that's developed. As you're dealing with shipping flower boards and working on those supply chain issues, I'm not naming individual companies, but as an industry, we've developed a bottleneck in extraction. And again, so that's a great, valuable opportunity that is still there. And so that, making those products, put them on the shelves is going to be really, really interesting and disruptive. I think in a year's time, we're going to see major shifts in the level of revenue, particularly profitability or gross margin of that revenue across kind of all industry peers. And we're going to see some people do far better and some do far worse over the next 12 months. So that's really exciting. And of course, the kind of underlying factor of this is supply. When are we going to hit supply equilibrium? And we hear, you could ask 100 people and get 100 different answers, but my current view is that we're closer to 3 years away, maybe 2.5 now, because if it was just flower, we'd be kind of getting there. We see, many have probably getting a chance to tour Aurora Sky on this trip, and I look forward to touring this afternoon. Those facilities are getting up online. We see many other producers talking about the efficiency of their facilities. So that product is coming, but if it was just flower, we'd probably get there within a year. We'd probably hit a reasonable amount of supply. But now you have all the producers saving that inventory, and those non-processed inventory levels that aren't moving into finished goods, and which is consternation at Health Canada and Bill Blair, and why is that unfinished good not moving into finished goods? And I think it's 2 reasons. I think there's a lot of that flower that's not sellable as flower, and that's queuing up for oil production. But a lot of it is saving that supply. Why would I put out $4 grams or $3 grams wholesale when I can just hold on to that flower and turn it into a 10, 15? When you get to chocolates, it's $50, $60 per equivalent gram of that flower. You're going to save that product. And then you also have to build extracted product inventories. And we don't want to, if you're a producer and you had the pain of not being able to fulfill a reorder from one of your major forever partners. I mean, you're always going to be dealing with the OCS. So do you really want to, upset the OCS by not having that reorder ready that you committed to? You're going to make sure that the second time around, you have tons of inventory in stock. And that just further squeezes the supply chain. And so what that means then is I think people are going to be hoarding cannabis, hoarding oil to make those products. And then, like anything, 20% of your products are going to be winners, 80% will be kind of okay or losers, and then you're going to have to adjust your supply lines and your supply chain and your manufacturing lines. That's going to take 6 months to a year. And then where I think it all gets fixed is in outdoor growing. I mean, Jeanette, point to her empty seat where she just was, but Jeanette is, she filed an application to be the first outdoor grow. 2019 is certainly it's an aggressive time frame to get plants in the ground this summer, but I commend, being a first mover is always worth it. But in 2020, we're going to see a lot of outdoor grows. We've seen a lot of companies announce land acquisition. And that outdoor cultivation is going to come to harvest in late October 2020, have to get, extracted, tested. Spring, summer 2021 is when I think we're going to hit that equilibrium. And so we have between now and then to really figure things out and pick your spots, pick your opportunities, and see how you want to attack the industry. So I think it's really exciting. And once we do hit that supply equilibrium, then the power, I think, really shifts to, again, the product makers and particularly retail. And so whether you're a craft cultivator, a cultivation applicant, or a micro-license processor, or a licensee, or a retailer, I think the future is very bright. It's very exciting. And this is just Canada. The world is there. The U.S. Obviously has its own peculiarities around that, and with Mark Lustig of Origin House, I think here today, we'll hear from that. He's done a great job in California, but there's a lot of U.S. opportunities, and of course, globally, everything that we do over the next year in Canada is going to basically create that momentum, those building blocks to go attack the global markets, and I think Canada's well positioned for that. So I think with that, maybe we move to our fireside chat. Thanks.
All right, we're going to do a little Ask Me Anything on the stage
sure.
here, I guess, eh? There are a couple of mics that will kind of be roaming around in the audience as well. So if anybody has a question that they'd like to ask Chuck, feel free to put your hand up. We'll have somebody will run to you with the mic, and when we get a pause, we will turn to you and have you ask a question. Okay, so I'm going to start. I'm going to take you back a little bit, Chuck. We're going to go back to the beginning. You know, many of the people that I've talked to in the industry, certainly a lot of the clients and contacts that I have, they have an origin story. They have something that sort of caused them to, or kind of create the passion for them to get into the business of cannabis. So you were clearly a pioneer, co-founding Tweed back in 2013. It was only 6 years ago, but as you said, it's a little bit like dog years. So 6 years ago is probably like 100 years almost in regular time. So what was your passion or drive to get into the business of cannabis?
Yeah, for me, it's probably not a dissimilar story to many people, but I was always very libertarian, kind of anti-drug war, et cetera, as many were growing up from, even grade school, I guess, very early. But I always told myself that if I could legally get into the cannabis business in some way, that I would want to do that. Yeah. And I think I was, but for me, it was, there's a lot of stigma, and we're still breaking the stigma. I talked about that earlier, but it's, 6 years ago, looking for investors to, it used to be a lot harder to raise money back then, before there was a licensing regime under Harper, with just draft regulations. But I had to whisper marijuana in a Starbucks to help get money, and there was a lot of risk to it. But for me, I think the spark, if you will, was I had a back injury, nothing severe. I've met many people that deal with pain and how cannabis helps with that. But I was hospitalized for about a day. I was given opiates, and I ended up with something called Dilaudid hydromorphone, which is, Auxly is about 1.5 times a unit of morphine, and hydromorphone is about 5 times. So
wow.
It's strong stuff. And I was only given 10 days of pills, and haven't had, knock on wood, no wood here, but it hasn't happened again. But I went through that. And if I was in the U.S., I probably would have been granted 90-day prescription, because people are a little more liberal with their Auxly and other kind of opiates there. And statistically, as a man, you have a 1 in about 300 chance of dying from an overdose if you've been prescribed 90 days of an opiate. And so after 10 days in Canada, I was already counting pills, and I know that is not a good sign, because I was just so scared to be back in that pain. And so I just told myself, this is probably going to happen again in my life. I need to find another solution. Yeah. But for me, it really shifted my brain. I grew up, I was never a cannabis user in high school, but I had a lot of friends who were very heavy cannabis users, and so I grew up around it. But it was never for me, and it took that thing to change. And of course, yeah. Since then, I think we all know somebody who's been helped by cannabis, and more people.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay. My next question is about, not necessarily about Tweed, but since you founded Tweed, you've gone on to found other companies, Nesta Holdings that you already talked about, and Auxly. Both of those are kind of investment companies, investing in either other cannabis companies or creating that supply chain that you were talking about. So my question is this: what did you learn from the Tweed experience that really helped maybe inform some of the decisions that you made later on to help make you as successful as you are today?
Sure. I mean, a couple things. One, certainly, you got to make your own luck. We're very lucky to be kind of the first cohort. But with that, you kind of like this idea that luck is when opportunity and preparedness come together. And what I think we're able to do at Tweed is Bruce and I knew early on that things with government could change. It had a hostile government, so it was all about speed. And so what I learned was the disproportionate advantage that first movers got. And in hindsight, we had no idea, how much of an advantage that would be at the time. But we were worried. So it was about scale and moving very fast. And of course, lots of mistakes get made when that happens. Things get hairy. Yeah. But being the first publicly traded company, it was about awareness for us. And I think we've seen that play out, again and again, where the industry is rewarding not just first movers but scale. And sometimes it looks like scale for the sake of scale, but when that scale allows you to go raise funds at an order of magnitude, more value, and you get an extra zero on your balance sheet, you can afford to make a lot more mistakes. And so we've seen time and again that's some of the lessons there. And for me, the kind of what the Tweed experience, to launch into Nesta and Auxly, when I was still in the early days at Tweed, what I was really seeing in California was just the lack of products. And again, vape pens. I talk about vape pens all day. I think this is going to be the product segment. It's concentrates of the largest segment in the U.S. Vapes are more than half of that.
Well, a lot of people don't want to smoke it, so that
Well,
the
exactly.
vape is their
And so the inhalation and it's and it works very well. Why have a cannabis infused coffee when you can just drink your coffee and use cannabis? But but it's again that lack of products. At one point in time, I thought maybe I'll go to the U.S. It was really killing me that 3-4 years ago we couldn't get into products.
Yeah.
Thankfully, people like Dina McPherson, who will be up, I think, on the panel next. The VCBC, early activists that help with the oil ruling that have really helped usher this in. For me, it was just all about setting up the building blocks and how can I invest and get involved with companies that I think have a chance to play in this next wave. But 3 or 4 years ago, that was it felt like throwing darts, pin the tail on a donkey with a blindfold, because you really didn't know how the industry would evolve.
Yeah, no, exactly. Okay, I'm just going to look to see, are there any questions in the audience? Okay, we've got one over here.
Hi, Chuck. Bill McDonald from Flower Advisory. And I was just wondering if you could tell us about the structure of Nesta, whether it's a conventional PE 2 and 20 type based firm, and what kind of investment you're looking at in cannabis.
Sure. Yeah. Thanks for the question. No, not a traditional fund. Or at least it wasn't. Nesta started off as just a place to hang my hat and figure out where I was going to go. And we had whole kind of majority investments, operational investments in 2 companies, Feather, which vape pen. I hope to have a deal to announce soon with an LP in the country to put those in the market, and then a company called WeCann, which is price exploration for U.S. dispensaries. But then when I started Auxly, Nesta then became passive investments only, and so Nesta's invested in Dixie pre-IPO and in Burb recently, and Nesta's setting up a fund called Indica Fund out of Europe, which will be much more of a traditional kind of like a 1 in 5 and 20 model. For investment. And so the plan for Nesta going forward, because Auxly is really where I spend my time and where I try to drive the most value. Nesta is just there to have an additional pool of capital to just be able to help other businesses and make some good investments.
Okay, another question. I think Blue has one down in the front. Craig, Lindsay.
Chuck, it's been great so far. I'm interested to know your thoughts on this growing supply or growing inventory for extracts. And what is that going to do to input costs when we fire off formats 2.0? Is that glut going to change the starting point for a lot of companies? And then as that glut works through, how do you see the process as it flows through on a cost basis?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm not going to have a good answer for you. I think it depends. I think I'll say the larger the majors, if you will have incentive to hold on to that product. Why you have a bunch of products in inventory that cost you $1 or $2 a gram, or maybe 50 cents by that time, and you're not selling it all, but you're maxing out on your derivative products. Why would you sell that off to a competitor at $3 to $4 a gram to let them go and make 2-3x on that? So I think we'll see larger companies holding on to it, but we haven't really seen. I'm still not aware of any micro licensing that's been granted. But as those micro licenses come into play, or as outdoor licenses come into play, then the kind of existing large incumbents are not going to be able to affect the wholesale price, if you will, not control, but affect it. Yeah, so it's going to be interesting.
Can I just ask you a follow-up question on that? Synthetic CBD, where do you see that kind of playing in here? Because I feel like if you could just make some synthetic CBD as an ingredient, and you could do that cheaper, then all of these huge greenhouses and all that everybody's been building are going to be for naught.
Yeah, there's a number of companies invested in synthetic or harvesting cannabinoids from some kind of yeast process. Yeah. I think that's going to be useful for very rare cannabinoids. So there's I think when I first got in this industry, we knew about 80 cannabinoids. Now we know over 200. And there's going to be some rare cannabinoids that have very specific use cases where, whether it's a API for pharma or some clinical trial. And so for those rare cannabinoids that almost never naturally show up in cannabis plants or at such low quantities, I think there's a great opportunity to synthetically produce them. But when it comes to just THC, CBD, and the more kind of common top 5 or 6 cannabinoids, I think we'll still be growing it, especially with the emergence of low-cost producers in other parts of the world. With Auxly, we have I think we potentially have a dominant current kind of footprint in Latin America with our Uruguay operation. But you're growing CBD from hemp in outdoor fields, hundreds of acres, and it's incredibly low cost. I mean, it's pennies a gram, and so you can't get the product into Canada today. And so there's kind of this could be a very long answer, but I'll kind of shortcut it. Yeah. Is that Canada is only in the first 6 months of 2018 we only imported 0.6 kilograms of cannabis. And so although Health Canada doesn't prevent people from importing or exporting medical cannabis, in practice it's hard for the regulator to get comfortable with that foreign jurisdiction. There's many reasons why it's hard to import products, but as an industry, I view Canada as an island that we can only export. Nothing will come in. And so those low-cost cannabinoids are either for the long term, eventually they'll come into Canada, or for other jurisdictions. And so I think that'll beat out the synthetic. And we see people, Africa, Brazil, a lot of, we don't grow coffee beans in warehouses in Canada.
True. Good point. Question?
Chuck, Ian McDonald here. I was at the ArtView conference in Vancouver a couple weeks ago and met some really dynamic companies, probably 80% of them from the US, and they were talking MSO's the big story there in acquisition. But there was a fella there from Canada by the name of John Kay at the front of the room, very impressive young man, CEO, I believe, of Burb. Can you talk about Burb and what they're doing a bit? Impressive young man.
Sure. Well, sure, John will be very happy to for the question. Burb's interesting. In the same way that when I first invested in Tokyo Smoke, I got to know Alan Gertner and kind of his view. And whether you love or hate Tokyo Smoke, it was different. It got attention, and I think Burb has some of those interesting elements already in place, and it looks like they're I don't think they have a license yet, but they're in good shape to have one or a couple stores in BC shortly. And so it's this lifestyle brand. And so what I like about Burb, other than the design aesthetic and John himself, is that we don't know what the ideal retail environment is. Today, again, people talk about being the Starbucks of cannabis all the time, but I think what I find interesting about that saying is that 50 years ago, people just drank coffees in diners. I mean, it was just maybe 70 years now, but it was just black coffee. The coffee industry, as we know it, was not anything like it was. Starbucks introduced most people in North America to all the fancy coffees that you have in Europe. And so I think just as how when after prohibition of alcohol, we used to have to, not we, but our predecessors used to have to go buy alcohol at a window off a list and get it in a brown paper bag. It sounds very familiar to the cannabis buying experience. And so all that to say is that we don't know what the best practice will be for cannabis retailing, what those concepts will be. And so I think you have to make a lot of bets there. And it's going to be really interesting to see who will develop those other interesting concepts. I think there'll be several interesting concepts, but we really don't know. And I think it's not what you see. I don't think it's what you see today, like in Colorado or whatnot. It's just a counter and you're hit with all these products. I mean, there has to be something better than that, and a lot of people are working on that issue.
Hey Chuck, Brandon right here. Just a quick question for you about extracts and extract companies specifically. So we're seeing a lot more of this in the news these days. It's more of a hot topic as the evolution goes on, but these companies have now been in the works for potentially years at a time. So this ball's already rolling. Who do you think is going to be a leader in the extracts, and why? And also, who do you think is going to be having a difficult time, and why?
That's how to answer that. So obviously I'm biased. Auxly, we have a great facility at TheCannalysts and PI. People ask me, so I'll just do a little plug there. But people ask why PI, and I had the same question. Why are we buying something in PI? What's there? And I've been to PI, I love PI, but they have a biopharma hub, and they got 1,500 PhDs in a town of 60,000. So it's a great spot. And so we're set up well there. But I think it's really about with extraction licensing, time is the issue. There's a lag. And you can't just build that capacity in any short-term time frame. And so a lot of these Valens, Metapharm, and others these are 2 years in the making. And so again, that first mover advantage, the time to start is now, is today, to get into that. And there's still value to be a processor, in my view. And processors can very easily, for anybody worried about, well, there'll be too many processors, to take a processor license and become a product manufacturer, as you're white labeling and contract manufacturing other people's brands, it's very easy to develop your own brand. And so I think there's a great pivot for those companies, and that is, I still believe, the kind of the safest risk-reward kind of premium you'll get in this industry is on extraction. But I can't tell you who's doing better. I'm too biased.
There's a question over there. I can't see it. Yeah, go ahead. Do you have a mic?
Hi.
I'm curious what your thoughts are, Chuck, on legalization of cannabis in the U.S.
Yeah, I had the mic. I was standing with the mic.
All right, so we'll get you next. Legalization in the U.S. I'll quote. I don't know if John Fowler, when I was on his board, I love this line. The greatest gift the U.S. has given Canadian industry is not legalizing. It's given us time to ramp up and get scale. But of course, at this point, especially with the Farm Bill, people like John Boehner joining Acreage's board and others. I mean, the train has left the station. Even a year or 2 years ago, I would talk to very seasoned investors in Canada who still thought it was 20 years away. And I think, so for me, legalization in the U.S. is now about, we now have certainty that it is going to happen, and I think certainly that it will happen within 10 years. And probably 5 or 6. Another election cycle, maybe a second one, depending on what happens with our POTUS down there. But that's, I think if you look at, where would I bet money on legalization happening? I would look at Canopy's option on acreage. I think it's 90 months. I think a lot of smart people looked at that, and so I would say within 90 months we will have legalization in the U.S.
They knew something we didn't know.
Yeah, and it's that's going to be, you got the Goldman Sachs and the Merrill Lynch's and Wall Street and the
it's
capital.
It's very political too, right? It's all going to be who you know.
Well, it's again, the first move is it's access to capital in the early stages is very important. The U.S. is a capital generation machine. It's really the financial center of the world, and so we already see a dozen U.S. companies with very large valuations. I think they have a lot of backfilling to do in those valuations. I think there will be some very large MSOs, but when you look at individual MSOs, the one negative point I kind of take from them is that they are great investment vehicles. They've got good boards, they've got capital, they're multi-state, there's regulatory kind of diversification, and there's ultimately, I view every major U.S. investment as a regulatory arbitrage. And what I mean by that is you're just betting on the value that's going to be increased when they legalize. And there's going to be many milestones to that. There's going to be the Banking Act. Once they can actually bank, there'll be a major bump for most names. Or when they can, at one point, perhaps transact between states. Maybe we'll have kind of an insular legalization in the U.S. They won't be able to maybe ship outside the country, but if you can have one facility in California or Colorado serving every legal U.S. jurisdiction, there's great economies of scale there. But these MSOs individually, they get out operated by locals. So I think you might have 20 licenses in 20 states, but if you go to every individual state, they're not the top license in any one of those jurisdictions, speaking generally. And so I view MSOs as still relatively early stage, but you're really, any investment in a U.S. MSO for me is just an investment. It's you're buying an option on legalization.
Okay, we'll go over here. Yeah.
Thank you. Hi, Chuck. I'm Unity. I'm based in Vancouver. I've just been driving across Canada and visiting our legal cannabis retail stores. Everyone's doing an excellent job. Congratulations to all the retailers. There's one thing that's missing, and that's female-owned cannabis stores in Canada. And we know females are half the population, 80% of the buying power. And if we want to normalize consumption and have cannabis come into the homes, what do you think are the next best steps to begin investing in women so that we can start having a broader perspective heard across Canada?
Good question.
Well, thanks for the question. I'm glad you asked that because it allowed me to plug a great female entrepreneur in Ottawa, where I live, called Superette, and Mimi Lam there. She's ex-Tokyo Smoke, but she's built a really interesting concept, and obviously had to partner with a lottery winner, and so. But it's almost a destination. I think if anybody goes through Ottawa, you need to go to Superette, and it's like a diner, but for cannabis. Very approachable, greatest people in line of all ages, and so again, just another example of how somebody takes the kind of the sea of sameness that we see with a lot of retailers, a lot of the greens in the woods, and just doing something totally different that really has an impact. But I think for generally, and for investing in women in cannabis retail, I mean, we certainly need to have it be more open. If you're granting a lot of licenses, again, that just makes it easier, because in a license-constrained environment, it's going to be more individuals that have access to large amounts of capital to take companies public. And as we know, there's only about 1 out of 5 board members are women in public companies in Canada. And so if it's a big stakes game, then it's just going to be, there's already kind of a glass ceiling systemically in the model. And so I really do hope to see Ontario eventually open up as supply comes in, and I think we'll see a lot more female entrepreneurs, but certainly we always need more.
Are there lineups around the block at Supret?
Yeah, when the weather's good.
Yeah.
We have long, but yeah, there's still lineups. And yeah, there's only 3 retail stores in Ottawa. We're only supposed to get 1, so we're feeling quite fortunate.
Yeah, no kidding. There is a female-owned store in Toronto called the Honey Pot, and there's lineups down the street and around the corner every single day.
Yeah.
Every single day.
Yeah, no, I look forward to try to visit some Edmonton stores while I'm here, because it's
there's many to choose from.
Yeah, I'm very jealous of our last questioner, just for be able to visit all these different retail locations.
Yeah. Another question in the audience? I've got one if there's not one ready. Okay, yes?
The future of direct investing?
In British Columbia. In British Columbia cannabis specifically? Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. I don't have any, other than the bourbon investment, I don't have much exposure to the BC kind of regulatory environment for cannabis, but I do know that the agricultural lands, there's some issues with some cultivators. It's BC is, when I first got into this industry 6 years ago, I remember telling my wife, like, if this takes off, we're gonna have to move to Vancouver, because that's gonna be where the epicenter is. But because of mainly the lack of banking in the early days. Now we see, BMO and others. Big shout out to the big banks that are now coming in. But at that time, it really became Toronto centric, and I just find it really bizarre that BC is finally starting to grant a lot of retail licenses, so that they're getting there. But there's, I find just that there seems to be, at some level, I don't know where it comes from, there is some kind of systemic hostility to the industry out of BC, and maybe it's just because it's been essentially legal there for a couple decades, and so it doesn't have the same...
The gray market.
Yeah.
I'm gonna ask a question now, so if you guys want to think for a minute so that you're ready to go after me. I'm curious about your thoughts on globalization, and in particular, I mean, there's a lot of talk about the fact that Canada has this dominant position. We were first G7, so we were first at the table. We've really built up, a first mover advantage that you keep talking about. But as it's going global, there's this concern about whether we're going to lose that dominant position. And in particular, are we going to have brain drain? Are we going to have our, best and brightest leaving the country? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think it's... a brain drain is certainly great for the people that are being drained out. They're getting a great opportunity to go see the world, and but it's I think that's already started in some ways. I think it's inevitable. I mean, if in some ways Canopy with Constellation's kind of control investment is you could say that's a U.S. company now, right? I mean, but it's still headquartered here, but ultimately it's where's the mind control, right? Are they making all the decisions out of Smith Falls, or are their executives having to fly out to wherever?
Although,
New Jersey?
because we're geeky CPAs, I will say I noticed Constellation doesn't consolidate Canopy,
no, exactly,
which I found
right.
very interesting.
And then but Kronos with Altria, and so we already see the industry kind of going that way. I think the key to keep our global advantage, I think, it ultimately comes down to capital, and we see this as well with the need for consolidation in the industry, where why do people have this need to feel to get bigger? And I think the issue is when you get a $5 billion investment or a $2 billion investment into a company, that's a lot of capital. But if you're not able to raise a tenth of that, then you start really feeling that you're going to miss out on opportunities, because so if you're not raising you're not able to have a couple $100 million to play with. Somebody with a few billion, they can afford to make 80% of that capital can be huge mistakes. but they'll still have invested 10 times what you've invested and done well with it.
Yeah.
And so the capital, I think, is and the access to capital and really the strength of balance sheets in the industry is really driving that M&A and that fear of missing out on global opportunities.
Yeah.
And so every larger, bigger deal kind of sets the new bar of everybody has to be at least here.
Yeah. Okay, we have time for another, go ahead.
My name's Barinda Rasodi. I'm founder of Niche Canada and CEO of Grow Tech Labs. And thank you for your question, because that's along the lines that I'm thinking around the brain drain and as we're globalizing is the role of innovation in Canada. And I'm quite concerned that government has said that they're going to be funding innovation and education, but they're still a little slow to get out the gate. And Chuck, very interested from your perspective as a leader and an influencer and somebody who puts their money where their mouth is on the value of innovation for Canada as the first country in the G7 who has legalized cannabis, and as we're looking at now emerging markets around the world, and what you see the role of innovation could be in maintaining our lead on cannabis, because I think other countries will surpass us just because the dynamics of the market, labor supply, climate, and all of those things. So is innovation something that we should be putting on the forefront?
Yeah, so certainly, there's a lot of ways to attack that question, and I'll kind of focus on a very, very narrow piece of it. I think, or two pieces. One, I think we have to, whatever political stripe you are, obviously I'm well known as a liberal, card-carrying liberal, but, we have a government that ushered legalization in and took that political risk and made it their platform. And but they haven't been, I think it's just anytime they speak about cannabis, it's a beacon for a political attack. And so, in any other jurisdiction, I think you would see the Trudeau government really talking about how great Canada has done, how great their provincial partners have done. But they don't talk about it. So there's still some I'll call it political stigma around that going into an election year. But I think, more specifically, the biggest disadvantage Canadian companies have, and I talked about earlier about kind of the brand race, it's not yet begun, is the advertising and kind of the branding prohibitions. When we look at the rest of the world, especially with the U.S. coming on board and California brands, cannabis is going to become more mainstream. It's going to be in popular culture, on your favorite Netflix show, etc. And we're going to start seeing American brands, and the rest of the world is going to be inundated with American brands. And if Canadians could, Canadian companies, the industry, could have a little more liberal advertising rules, that'll help us combat that. It's not going to happen today. I mean, we always knew. I think the smart money in the room always knew we were going to be very tobacco-esque in our prohibitions. However, I do believe, and I'll kind of end with this, is that we will see, alcohol is really permissive. Ontario, we're allowing tailgate parties, and we have the government putting out people,
beer at 9 o'clock in the morning.
People looking super happy drinking, and then we have cannabis. But I think they have to meet. They will meet eventually, because it just becomes clear, as most people will realize that cannabis is safer than alcohol in most instances, that it doesn't make sense for cannabis to be one way or the other. But public health advocates want alcohol to be like tobacco. And so that battle's going to play out, and where they meet is really anyone's guess. But personally, I would bet on cannabis getting looser, because alcohol would never get legalized today, but it's just too entrenched in society, and I don't see that shifting
Pulling
harder.
back, yeah.
So that allows me to sleep at night, and I look forward to kind of governments at all levels just becoming a little more comfortable, and really ultimately governments listen to Canadians and your average kind of non-cannabis user Canadian as they get more comfortable. It's not the devil's weed, that they'll be able to loosen that a little bit, and we'll be able to compete globally.
Okay. Well, that is all the time we have with Chuck today. So thank you, Chuck, for coming out today.
Thank you.
Really
Thank you.
appreciate it.
Thanks
Thank you
a lot.
very much.
Great. Thank you very much.
You can wait.